and welcome once more to Freethought History Webinar, the seventh in our series. This time featuring Bill Cooke, who, as it happens, actually launched this series last year, talking about H.G. Wells. The video of that you can find on our YouTube channel. I'm Daniel James Sharp. I'm the editor of the Freethinker, your host this evening. And just so you know, this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube and our website afterwards. So Bill is going to talk about the debate over Jesus Christ's historicity and Christ's mythicism. And he'll give a little presentation on that, and then we shall open it up for questions and discussion. So with all of that out of the way, I shall hand over to Bill and I shall get the presentation up and ready to go.
Thank you, everybody, for turning up to this. I'm going to present a fairly robust case, hopefully, for us taking seriously the idea of Jesus Christ as a historical person. I'm worried about the prevalence of mythical Jesus theory among the humanist community, and I worry about the impact that it has on the academic credibility of humanist thought generally. Next slide, please. Right. Just a few slides of basic background material. I imagine you'll all know this sort of stuff. There have been three quests for the historical Jesus. The first quest in the 19th century, distinguishing the historical Jesus from the theological Christ. The second one, mid-century, looking toward the theological significance of an immanent conception of Jesus. And then the third one, which is sort of petering out now, but is very much where we are at the moment, reclaiming the Jewishness of Yeshua ben Yosef, which is, of course, the likely name that Jesus Christ had, given that he was a Jew. Next slide, please. None of this is up for discussion. None of this is controversial from our point of view. No Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. That's been understood for more than a century. Few of the words of Jesus can reliably be attributed to him, and as such, Jesus Christ is a later construct. Paul invented Christianity, not Jesus. The New Testament is primarily, not exclusively, primarily an exercise in theology, and many themes in Jesus's life and ministry can be seen in other traditions. So these are pretty standard conclusions that have been arrived at in the three quests for the historical Jesus that we've seen so far. Next slide, please. Now, the position that I'm going to be criticizing is the idea that Jesus never existed at all. That is what a myth theorist is. A myth theorist is somebody who argues that there was never such a person as Jesus Christ. Now, the main exponents of that today, Earl Doherty, Robert Price, and Richard Carrier. There's another related theory advanced by people like Thomas Thompson and until his death, G.A. Wells. Toward the end of George Wells's career, he ended up with the idea that Jesus is somebody buried in so much myth and theology that his existence is rendered irrelevant. So it's mainly the first type of myth theorist that I will be discussing and subjecting to some criticism this evening. Next slide, please. The idea that mythicists do not agree on what Jesus Christ actually was. Some say that he's part of a dying and resurrected God mythology. Others say that he's a celestial savior given a terrestrial history. And others, again, talk about a sacred cult played out in a religious drama. So they can't agree as to how Jesus should actually be understood. Richard Carrier has described all myth theories before his own as crazy and amateurish. Next slide, please. You've got to bear in mind there are two trajectories in which Jesus can be understood. There's the upward trajectory, which is the standard account I will be defending, that sees a human being, Yeshua ben Yosef, acquiring ever more godlike attributes. Then there's the mythicist idea that it's the trajectory is downward. Mythicists argue that a deity was given a human backstory. That is the theory that I will be criticizing. Next slide, please. When you look at the New Testament, there's clearly an upward trajectory in the writings of the New Testament. In Mark, the earliest of the Gospels, Jesus is born of a woman. In Matthew and Luke, he's given a virgin birth. And in John, he's the Word made flesh. He was always there in the cosmos and just came down, had a 30-odd year incarnation as God as made flesh on the planet. And then when he died, he said, "It is finished," and returned to heaven where he started with, as opposed to the Jesus of Mark, who said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So there's a clear upward trajectory of a person being turned into a god, which is what the first 3 centuries of the Christian story tell us. Next slide, please. Now moving to some specific criticisms of the mythicist theory. It's amateurish. Bart Ehrman, in his book Did Jesus Exist?, says that no current mythicist work is written by scholars trained in New Testament or early Christian studies at any accredited higher education facility. This was the same more than 100 years ago when F.C. Conybeare criticized J.M. Robertson. The untrained explorers who I criticize here discover on almost every page connections in their subject matter where there are and can be none, and as regularly miss connections where they exist. So the problems that were noted more than a century ago remain endemic in the myth theory as understood and advanced today. Next slide, please. Why, for example, is there no debate on the mythical Jesus in relevant academic literature, such as the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus? The only thing I could find was a marginal comment that described it as problematic and unpersuasive. For a theory to be held, to be taken seriously, it's got to have some track record in academic literature. This is not the case with the myth theory. That's why I use the phrase amateurish. It's not a term of abuse. It's just a recognition that it is not established within the academic literature. Next slide, please. There are some very worrying entry-level errors of logic that constantly are made by the mythicist scholars. The basic idea that because the New Testament is full of theology and a lot of the history is dodgy, therefore Jesus doesn't exist, is an obvious non sequitur. It doesn't follow that scattered and problematic evidence is evidence for non-existence. Also endemic in the myth theory is the argument from silence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This should be obvious. There is also a false equivalence being made regularly, placing 2 theories side by side as if they carry equal weight and authority, which they don't. There's the post hoc ergo propter hoc. Jesus's story, including mythological elements, does not mean that Jesus is a myth along the same lines. Again, this should be obvious. And Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the one to be preferred. Historicity is the simplest explanation. These are just some of the entry-level errors of logic that is a constant problem in the myth theory of Jesus. Next slide, please. Robert Price and Richard Carrier both agree on the same idea. The cardinal tenet of mythicism is, according to Robert Price, is that writers who might have been expected to mention Jesus do not. he has particularly the Pauline epistles in mind. And Richard Carrier says the same as well in his book. No, I can't read what's being said. The silences of the epistles are thus the strongest evidence against historicity. This was a big argument of George Wells too when he was alive. So it's a basic idea of the mythicists that the silence of Paul, as it's known, is the concluding evidence for the non-existence of Jesus. But next slide, please. Morris Casey, in his book Jesus, Evidence and Argument, or Mythicist Myths, deals with this problem directly. It has been, he says, correctly noted that there are not many references to the teaching of the historical Jesus in the epistles. This is because they are not lives of Jesus, but occasional letters to the churches, mostly about particular problems in them, all written in a high context situation in which everything members believed did not have to be constantly repeated. This is a simple and obvious point that mythicists don't really address or deal with in any constructive way. Next slide, please. Some of the mythicist arguments just get quite abusive or sarcastic. This book, for instance, a self-published book, that mythicism explains the record better is not to be disputed. To do so would be a waste of time and effort. And the same person, only a page later, says, before continuing, I must note that anybody that fails to see how the minimal mythicist theory perfectly, at least in a relative sense, fits the evidence, ought to leave the discussion. Well, I'm sorry, that's not how it works. If you don't agree, you continue discussing, not to just decide that our opinion is the only valid one, that everybody else should leave the discussion. That is not the way that scholarly debate takes place. Next slide, please. A significant problem with the mythicist theory is that it's sterile. Good theories have explanatory power. Mythicism explains nothing. It can explain nothing about how Christianity evolved. The growth of Christology cannot be understood in mythical terms. So the theory is sterile. There's nothing that it can lead to. When you look at the couple of people who tried to use the myth theory in their books, Paul Kurtz in one of his books, The Transcendental Temptation, I think it was, and Michael Martin in Atheism, A Philosophical Justification, both referred to it, but they couldn't do anything with it because there's nothing that you can do with it. The idea is sterile. Next slide, please. Now, even if some version of the myth theory is correct, what would it achieve? Would Christianity be severely compromised if it were demonstrated that Jesus of Nazareth was a myth? That Christianity turned a Jewish prophet into an enemy of the Jews is a far more damaging conclusion to reach. And that is the reach undertaken and understood by scholars across the spectrum over the last century and a half. Far more damaging than the idea of Jesus Christ not existing. It's not been a problem for Taoism, for instance, that Lao Tzu may not have existed. It's not a problem for Judaism that Abraham or Moses might not have been historical characters. So it's sterile. It doesn't help the argument in any way, even in the unlikely event of it being correct. Next slide, please. The only element, this is Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, the only element of the basic myth theory that is even incredible, at least at first look, is the idea that a transition from a secret cosmic savior to a public historical one happened within 2 generations and without a clear record of it occurring. So at least here, Richard Carrier is being honest enough to recognize what the problem is. This is the elephant in the room. Mythicists expect us to believe that a secret cosmic savior turned into a historical figure in 2 generations, despite there being no clear record of it occurring. Well, I'm sorry, that's not a credible argument to proceed with, particularly as all the evidence shows an upward trajectory from an historical figure to a cosmic one. Next slide, please. Looking at the weight of evidence, the denial of existence of Jesus is an improbable solution, since the available evidence does not show a creation ex nihilo of the character, but one of a transformation, admittedly a very deep one. So here, this was a very recent, quite interesting book between Richard Carrier and two defenders of a slightly different historicity notion that I would support, but they're both arguing that Jesus was a historical person. And they're saying what I'm saying, that it's an improbable solution, seeing all the available evidence in the New Testament shows the creation of a character becoming a cosmic creature, a cosmic being. Next slide, please. Now, there's another theme that we've got to look at, and this is that mythicism is a theology. It's not actually an academic position, it's a theology. If you look at on the left here, Christ resurrected, only Christian fundamentalists believe that. On the right, Jesus is a myth. Only atheist fundamentalists believe that. But the idea of Yeshua as a Jewish prophet has been advanced and defended by Jews, by Christians, and by atheists. So there's a considerable agreement among people without regard to their own theological position about Jesus as a Jewish prophet, which is what the scholarship over the last century and a half has been working toward. But the myth theory is a new form of Lysenkoism. If you remember Lysenko, the Lamarckian biologist in Stalin's Russia, only Stalinists could agree with Lysenkoism, in the same way that only atheists can agree with Jesus being a myth, and only Christian fundamentalists can agree that Christ is resurrected. They're theologies. They're arguments that start on a presupposition. The only argument that seems to have a scholarly basis that people can hold without regard to their theological position is that Yeshua is a Jewish prophet who over a series of time became Jesus Christ. Next slide, please. The rival theologies, I'm just going to continue with this theme for a bit. Evangelical exceptionalism, the teachings of Jesus Christ are utterly original, proving that he is the Son of God. It doesn't, of course, but that's the evangelical claim. The mythicist exceptionalism operates in exactly the same way. The teachings of Jesus Christ have earlier parallels, proving he never existed. Well, again, this is a simple non sequitur. Nothing is proved by doing this. And they both show evangelical fundamentalism and atheist fundamentalism both have the same modus operandi. Next slide, please. It's the same with the dogmatism, evangelical dogmatism. This man, Chris Wright, says we need to regain our confidence in the reality and truth of the gospel we say we believe. It is not true because we believe it. So he's saying it's true because it's true. Mythicist dogmatism works in a similar way. We have arrived at the conclusion that the gospel tradition seems completely unreliable. These are both similarly dogmatic stances, both suggesting that they operate more as a theology than as an academic body of thought. Next slide, please. Again, this book that just came out a few months ago between Richard Carrier and these two historicists, this is an interesting thing. Christians, the historicists are saying Christians dehistoricize Jesus, making him a divine being descended on the earth, whilst mythicists dehistoricize his figure, although more radically. In short, one can argue that in some important respects, mythicism, far from being the contrary of confessional exegesis, is really its mirror, the other face of the same coin. And this is the point I'm making, that mythical Jesus is a mirror image of evangelical Christianity. They are both theologies. They are not academic positions. Next slide, please. Now, just looking very briefly at what the actual facts about the historical Jesus seem to be. Looking at E.P. Sanders's very good book, for example, these points, he says, and I think that should be seen as correct, almost beyond dispute, the facts of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. I won't go through them all, but there they are. Those are the facts that seem to be unarguable, and nobody outside of mythicists does argue them. Next slide, please. These are some of the references to Jesus in the New Testament that suggest a historical person. There are other ones. These are some of the main ones. Again, we don't go into all the detail, just to show these are some of the references to Jesus as a historical person in the New Testament. Next slide, please. So what happens when they come up with some of this material? So when the fullness of time has come, in Galatians, God sent forth his son, made of a woman, made under the law. There's a clear reference to Jesus as a historical person. You get this sort of arm waving from the mythicists, where Richard Carrier says we can infer nothing useful from Paul's equally vague and theological declaration that Jesus came from a mother. It should be, that just seems manifestly inadequate. That's just arm waving. He might not be able to infer anything useful from Galatians 4:4, but everybody else can. Next slide, please. The other point that hasn't been brought up among the general criticisms of the myth theory that I think really needs to be spent some time on is that there's a latent anti-Semitism in the myth theory that, again, is not surprising, given that the myth theory is a mirror image of evangelical Christianity with its latent anti-Semitism. One would expect to see the same in the myth theory. Mythicists and evangelicals both ignore what is now called historical plausibility for a Jewish context for Jesus. Both groups treat the Gospels as non-historical. The fundamentalists, because the Gospels are inspired, and the atheists, those who hold this view, because the Gospels are accepted by some people as sacred scriptures and so are not historical. So both evangelicals and mythicists are ignoring the historical plausibility of the Jewish context for Jesus. This phrase, historical plausibility, I think it might have been Geza Vermes who was the one who first brought this about in the third quest for the historical Jesus. Geza Vermes is the person who really needs to be understood with respect to the third quest. And this idea of historical plausibility is the way that we can see that a Jewish Jesus makes historical sense given the material that we have in front of us. And that is ignored and denied both by the evangelicals and the mythicists. Next slide, please. Robert Price, another senior mythicist figure, is quite specific about dismissing attempts to place Jesus in his Jewish historical setting. He just sees it as warm, fuzzy ecumenism without historical justification. Once again, he said, we are left without adequate evidence for what Jesus may have thought or taught about issues of Judaism and the Torah. Well, again, he may be left without adequate evidence, but Geza Vermes, look at Charles Freeman's excellent history of the New Testament. Most scholars see that there's plenty of evidence for a Jewish context to Jesus. There's no necessity for warm, fuzzy ecumenism. Next slide, please. Another important buzzword in the third quest for the historical Jesus is this idea of supersessionism. This was a Geyser-Vermisch term. A major theme, supersessionism, the idea that the Christian message of the New Testament supersedes the Jewish message of the Old Testament. Now, Vermisch talks about this in his very good Christian history of the first decades of Christianity. Within decades after the crucifixion, the church turned away from the Jewish temple, and soon after AD 70, Christian supersessionism began, founded on the view that the destruction of Jerusalem and its sanctuary proved the rejection of Judaism by its God and its replacement by a new people of God. So in order to take the idea of the third quest seriously, we've got to understand how important this idea of supersessionism is. Christianity is a supersessionist religion. That's why it calls the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament. And it's a way of disparaging it and putting it down, marginalizing it and putting it to one side so that their less credible and indeed latently anti-Semitic and sometimes specifically anti-Semitic message is layered over the top of the original Jewish nature of Yeshua ben Yosef. And what the mythicists are doing is not any different. It is another attempt at supersessionism. Our idea of a mythical Jesus supersedes everything said in the Hebrew Bible and said in the New Testament as well, which provides for a Jewish historical plausibility for Yeshua ben Yosef. Next slide, please. Again, you see this mirror image with respect to supersessionism. So evangelical supersessionism is the Jewish Yeshua is superseded by our notion of Jesus Christ, Son of God and Redeemer of mankind. Mythicist supersessionism, the Jewish Yeshua is superseded by our notion of Jesus Christ as a myth. They're both examples of supersessionism, both looking to marginalize, disparage, and overlook the Jewish historical plausibility of Yeshua ben Yosef. That is a latent anti-Semitism, which sometimes becomes a specific one, and it should be something that humanists want no part of. Next slide, please. Morris Casey has made this point as well. The Gospels are clearly set within first century Judaism. This is a major problem for the mythicist view, because mythicists generally wish to present early Christianity as a Hellenistic cult and never offer any proper explanation of the major Jewish elements in the synoptic Gospels. So there's the problem that the mythicists need, or one of the problems that the mythicists need to address, how they can make their case without being supersessionist in the same way that evangelicals are. Next slide, please. So, Yeshua ben Yosef. Yes, Jesus Christ is a spurious compound. This goes back to the 19th century. Charles Voysey spoke of it in those terms. A spurious compound of Yeshua ben Yosef. But Yeshua ben Yosef, or someone like him, was a real person whose beliefs have been buried under layers of theological slag. Mythicists confuse this very important distinction. It's one thing to be buried under layers of mythological slag. It's then a completely different thing to say, therefore he didn't exist. That's like saying 2 and 2 make 17. It doesn't. Next slide, please. Now, look at this consensus among scholars related to Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus Christ. Geyser-Vermisch, who I've mentioned before, a Jew for most of his life. says Jesus was thoroughly Jewish in his role of teacher, exorcist, and preacher, prophet, and son of God. Lloyd Geering, a Christian theologian, the original Jesus of Galilee was not the Messiah and never claimed to be. He was a teacher, a sage, who more closely reflected the wisdom tradition of Israel than the prophetic. And then the humanist philosophers group, 20 odd 5 years ago, said the same thing. Did Jesus exist? Almost all scholars believe that Jesus existed in the 1st century CE in Palestine. So there you have Jew, Christian, atheist, all quite happily agreeing that Jesus is Jewish and that the New Testament record, the historical plausibility, amounts to Jesus being a Jew who is later on buried under layers of theological slag. That is not to then claim that Jesus is non-historical in any way, is, as I say, adding 2 and 2 and getting 17. Next slide, please. Again, so Bart Ehrman, Jesus best understood as a Jewish prophet who anticipated a cataclysmic break in history in the very near future when God would destroy the forces of evil to bring his own kingdom here on earth. And Christopher Rowland, and look at who published that, SPCK, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge. He could say, as far as one can ascertain, Jesus did not envisage a religious system independent of Judaism. That is far more radical and far more dangerous to Christian supersessionist ideas than any idea about Jesus being mythical, particularly as the ideas of Jesus being mythical do not stand scholarly scrutiny and can only be held by people who already are committed to the idea and hence operating as a theology and not as an academic body of thought. Next slide, please. Why this is being discussed here is Bart Ehrman says this, and I think he's right. Mythicists do humanism no favors. By staking out a position that is accepted by almost no one else, they then open themselves up to mockery and charges of intellectual dishonesty. So because the myth theory is so unusual, so extreme, that it's a theology, not a body of thinking, it's going to discredit humanism, and it's going to make humanist scholarship in other areas more problematic because of the association with this discredited and discreditable body of work. Next slide, please. The real Yeshua, again, Bart Ehrman puts it as well as anybody. The Jesus proclaimed by preachers and theologians today had no existence. Nobody's doubting that. That particular Jesus, or those particular Jesuses, are a myth. But there was a historical Jesus, and he was very much a man of his time. That's such an important distinction to make that mythicists just seem incapable of making it. And it skews the argument and puts humanist scholarship into a discrediting position. I've said in an article that's just come out, so I've just got my copy today, in fact, the mythicism is like defending phrenology in an age of neuroscience. So I'm hoping that, like phrenology, we can put it behind us, engage with other people who understand Jesus as a Jew, recognize how profoundly damaging that is for the Christian story as understood. And that's what we should be working on. Next slide, please. Here's a brief bibliography of the people, the books that I've used. There's plenty more, of course, but this would be a minimum starting point. All of these are excellent books that give an account of the way that we can understand Jesus, the historical plausibility of Jesus as a Jewish figure who was buried under layers of theological slag and became a god. Next slide, please. So, to sum up, these are the points that I'm making. Mythicism is not academically credible, but it operates as a theology. 2, mythicism relies on a range of fallacies, and it doesn't just incidentally have them. Most theories you can find a fallacy somewhere. The point about mythicism is it actually relies on these fallacies. It relies on the non sequitur of the problematic nature of evidence of Jesus in the New Testament proves that he doesn't exist. So that you cannot have a myth theory without basic entry level fallacies of logic. Mythicism also has a cultic quality, characterized by passionate belief by a small minority. I've certainly never come across people as combative and occasionally as abusive as mythicists. And there's something about that cultic theology of it that is problematic for us as humanists. 4, mythicism is sterile. It can't actually help in any way. It can't add to the argument in any serious way. It's got nothing to say about Jesus as a Jew and the historic plausibility of Jesus' Judaism. And in fact, not only does it can't have nothing to say about that, it's specifically supersessionist in the same way that Christian evangelicals are. Leading to 5, mythicism mirrors the mistakes of evangelicals. And like the evangelicals, mythicism is latently, I'm not saying that all mythicists are specifically anti Semitic. I'm saying mythicism is latently anti Semitic in its supersessionism. And as a result, mythicism is an embarrassment for humanism, and it's something we need to try and corral and get into a position where it can be rendered neuter. Next slide, please. So I've made no points about putting a strong case here, but it seems to be important to make this case as clear as possible so that we can cut the ground out of it and deal with what really matters as to how we as humanists respond to the Christian story and respond to the claims being made and respond to the scholarship. And it seems to me that the scholarship of the third quest, advanced by Jews, Christians, and atheists, that Jesus is a historical character, a Jew who was buried under layers of theological slag, seems by far the most academically sound and in line with humanist principles. And that's what we should be advancing. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you, Bill. I notice in there's a lively chat box today. This is something that is very hotly debated, as you mentioned, and I think the Freethinker is a good place to conduct the debate. We're open to airing the debate, and I'm sure we'll get onto some of that in a very few short moments. But firstly, just to anticipate maybe what some people might have to say, a two-part question, Bill. Would you say are there any aren't there isn't there a growing list of legitimate, respectable theorists? I think Richard Carrier keeps a list on his website, for example. And would you do you have any good things to say about the mythicists?
No.
All right. Okay. Okay, well, we'll open it up to the audience there then. I will, as I said, the comment section has been lively, so if anyone's asked something, please ask again so that I can see it without having to go back. But first of all, I see Akash has his hand raised, so I shall ask him to speak.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So I just had a couple of questions for Bill because I feel like there were one or like a number of things that you mentioned that I think were a little bit contradictory. First of all, you mentioned that there's no like mythicist peer-reviewed scholarship, but you literally cited some of them. You cited Richard Carrier's, like his book, Proving History on the History of Jesus, and his recent one, The Obfuscate Paradigm, all peer-reviewed. So is Raphael Latasso's, if I'm not mistaken. And you mentioned another thing that mythicist scholarship, they don't, it's amateurish. I think you said they don't. I think it was that you said there's no debate and that the mythicists are not properly analyzing the facts. But if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to like whether or not uh, most scholarships, I mean, irrespective of whether or not you agree with them, what about the substance of what they say? I mean, whether or not they have the necessary qualifications or whether or not they're accepted by a certain journal doesn't necessarily discredit what they're saying.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I mean, look at Charles Freeman's History of the New Testament is published by Yale University Press. That's an unimpeachably prestigious publisher to publish a serious bit of work. So I'm not saying that all mythicists are amateurs. I'm saying that they are not operating within an academic climate and are not being published by reputable publishing houses or in reputable academic journals, and is amateurish to that extent.
But in terms of like the actual like substance of their arguments, you don't give any credit to, because if I'm not mistaken, there's not that much of a consensus that actually agrees that the kind of historical views that might have existed. If I'm not mistaken,
Well, you
there
are
was a developing.
mistaken. There is a reasonable consensus, and that is the the account I've been giving of Jesus as a Jew buried under many decades and then centuries of theological slag. And I've given examples of that being argued by Jews, Christians, and atheists. As much as there is a consensus, that's it at the moment.
But if I'm not mistaken, even James Charlesworth, for example, agrees there's no clear consensus on the kind of Jesus there was, and that there was a kind of consensus developing in the 80s, but that's kind of developed into a kind of chaos of opinion where everyone has a slightly different interpretation of the kind of Jesus that did exist.
Oh, yes, of course there are differences. I mean, the ones I showed between Geza Vermish and Lloyd Geering, for instance, they've got different ideas of whether Jesus is a prophet or a revolutionary. Yes, yes, yes. All of those are legitimate areas of dispute, and they're being discussed at this very moment. But none of them disagree that Jesus is Jewish and a historical character.
Okay, that was just the question I had.
I shall ask Bob to unmute himself.
Hello, Bill. Thanks
Good day, Bob.
for the punchy presentation. The Do you think one reason for the appeal of the myth theory to some freethinkers, notice I use the word freethinkers here, to some freethinkers was because it seemed to them that accepting the historical evidence was one step towards accepting his divinity?
In the 19th century, possibly, not now. I think I can understand why it's a tempting idea because it's if one can demonstrate that Jesus is a myth, then so far as the argument goes, a fatal blow to the credibility of Christianity has been given. It doesn't, of course, because it's sterile and it's not nearly as fatal as the idea that Jesus was a Jew who had no intention of starting a new religion. But yes, there are temptations with the mythical theory idea, and it's why it's been sort of an ongoing project in free thinking circles for more than 100 years.
All right. If anyone else has any questions, just sort of raise your hand physically or by using the button or by putting something in the comment box. Yeah, I mean, just to butt in for a second, do you think, Bill, do you think there's any sort of reasonable chance of mythicism becoming more accepted in the mainstream? Because mythicists would argue that that is happening currently. Do you take that seriously at all? I think I know the answer, but
Where's it being taken seriously?
oh well, that's what the mythicists would say. I don't have enough expertise on the argument
Right.
to comment.
It's not being taken seriously across the general academic world within the area of religious studies.
Okay, and there's no chance then of that ever changing in your view.
Well, it's hard to see how, given the weight of evidence for in the New Testament for the historical plausibility, the idea of Jesus being Jewish.
Okay, Nathan Alexander.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for your talk. I definitely think I lean more toward your side. I wanted to ask kind of more about the history of the mythicists' ideas. Is it something like that goes back to the 19th century, or is it earlier that we see people making these case?
Yes, it goes back to the 19th century. Bruno Bauer in the 19th century in English speaking, and then Arthur Drews, German scholar, very good German scholar too, generally. But in Britain, it was J.M. Robertson and an American, William Benjamin Smith, at the end of the 19th century, who advanced more problematic theories of the myth theory. Robertson loved the idea of Jesus as a sacred cult, and argued that in huge, great books. And the quotation by F.C. Conybeare that I started with had J.M. Robertson in mind. But yes, it goes back to the 1860s, and in the English-speaking world to the 1890s. And with J.M. Robertson leading it and William Benjamin Smith. And then it sort of waxed and waned a bit through the 20s and 30s. And it was not until after the war, really, or at least the 70s, where George Wells started to make academically reputable account for the mythical Jesus. But interestingly, of course, toward the end of his career, he stopped being a mythicist, and he recognized that that approach was sterile, and that he retreated more to the line that Thomas Thompson has taken, that there's so much theological slag on the buried Jesus figure that it doesn't actually matter particularly. That I suppose I could have been more charitable to Daniel's earlier question. Is there anything about the mythical theory? Well, yes. Thomas Thompson's idea and the late George Wells, perhaps, who argued that there's so much historical theological slag on the rotting corpse of Yeshua ben Yosef that whether he was historical doesn't matter. I don't agree with that, but that's a sound enough theory.
Charles Freeman wants to say something as it happens.
Thank you, Bill, for your reference to my book on early Christianity.
A very, very fine book.
Thank you very much for that. I do support your idea that according to recent scholarship, that Jesus was a Jewish preacher, and I have done some work on the problems that Christians had in isolating himself from Judaism.
Right.
And I think that that is an issue which needs further explanation about the way in which Christians developed an alternative tradition of Jesus, anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic, which has been a dreadful harm to Jewish, Jewish. We see it within the Christian churches, that there have been enormous anti-Semitism, the isolation of Christians from Judaism, when Jesus was originally a Jewish, within the Jewish tradition, as Gamer Vemesh has said and has argued. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, your book, you mentioned the mythical Jesus in one sentence in a new history of a new history of the New Testament, a new history of early Christianity. I'm sorry, you just say in one sentence there's no credibility to the theory.
No, I think it would be very difficult indeed to argue that there was no preacher of the name of Jesus. There are all kinds of myths developed as a result of his preaching, and the problem you get is, why was there nothing of his early life, and another problem is that he spoke in Aramaic, but the Gospels are in Greek, so that there's all kinds of mythological layers of have developed. And I think also that the academics are very isolated from the ordinary believers, particularly the fundamentalists.
Certainly.
Thanks, Charles. Couple more hands up. Dawn Wharton.
Yeah, thank you so much. A couple of points. Carrier made the point that we are anti-supersessionalists, and the charge of anti-Semitism is, I think, frankly outrageous. I organize humanist groups on many occasions. Jews are maybe 2 to 3% of the wider population. I will have as many as a third of my group be Jewish, and I feel nothing but warmth and positive regard for all of them. The notion that somehow the fact that we realize that the historical Jesus is radically improbable, is likely to be a complete and total void there, says nothing whatsoever negative about any Jewish person or Jewish thought or Jewish traditions, and the notion that we somehow should be ashamed of our anti-Semitism is outrageous ad hominem attacks that that should have no basis in any critical inquiry whatsoever. And another outrageous point that I think you made in this recent Free Inquiry article is that somehow, because I quote, conceded the possibility of being a historical Jesus, that somehow I've embraced historicism. Mythicists. Yeah, and by the way, the entirety of your claims about the excluded middle is total and complete bunk. You are the one that is your accusations of us not understanding the excluded middle is just an outrageous misrepresentation of where we stand. Obviously, there's nothing that can be said that totally completely removes the possibility of a historical Jesus somehow operating under the 98% slag that is the New Testament. But how do you identify the 2% that could possibly relate to this hypothetical historical Jesus? Carrier, I, and every other mythicist out there fully and completely acknowledges that there is some perhaps very slim possibility of a historical Jesus being out there in some way, shape, or form. But, we just don't think it's highly probable. And in my case, I'm asserting in my article that there is zero chance of any reliable knowledge being documented that would be accepted by a jury of non-Christians who are adequately informed of the historical background that we're dealing with. Anyhow, feel
Well,
free.
that's making the mistake so often that one sees in historicists of mythicists, I'm sorry, of expecting black and white certainty.
That's what
Nobody
I
is
am
saying
rejecting, sir. That is categorically what I am objecting to. We are not doing that. So stop asserting that we are.
so. The issue here, nobody's going to say that the case for any interpretation of Jesus is going to be absolutely certain. The
Well,
facts don't
thank
allow
you.
that.
Now,
So
give
nobody's
us
doubting
credit for
that.
not saying that then.
I started off
Give
at the
us
very beginning of
credit
my
for not
talk.
saying that, please.
I started off at the very beginning of my talk making that point. So it's not a question of there being utterly factual basis for historical Jesus. The point is the balance of the facts work in that direction overwhelmingly to what the mythicists have said. With respect to the anti-Semitism, I've been careful to say latent anti-Semitism. I'm not accusing any mythicist of being specifically and actually anti-Semitic. What I'm saying is that mythicist supersessionism is latently anti-Semitic in the same
Well,
has a latently
again,
anti-Semitic
we are
implication
rejecting
in the
your
same
claim.
way
We are
that
rejecting
evangelical
your claim that
Christianity does.
we are
If we could,
supersessionalists. You're
sorry, if we could just,
categorically rejecting that claim. Is that understood?
sorry,
You've made it often enough, yes.
I don't mean to mute you, but if you just let Bill, sorry, finish his point.
No, there's no more point to make, really.
Okay, well, time is running a bit short. Sorry to cut you off, Don, but Richard Carrier himself is here and wants to ask a question.
Yeah, I won't be long. Yeah, I mean, literally everything said in this is false, and is just the same stuff that you wrote basically a year ago, which I already refuted on my blog last year ago, and it's all like directly false and easily refuted. And I've done that. If people want to go see the actual evidence, because I don't just say that it's false, I show that it's false, case after case. People can go to look up Bill Cooke's name on my website at richardcarrier.info. But for the present time, what I want to point out is the slander against Raphael Lataster, also indirectly against Thomas Brodie, and myself, claiming that we haven't published under peer review through respectable publishers. That's totally false. There's been actually four, well, technically five, but easily four peer-reviewed books relating to the mythicist thesis. Three directly defending the mythicist thesis. The first was Thomas Brodie with Sheffield Phoenix in 2012, an Irishman. He was censored by the Catholic Church for doing it and banned from ever publishing again. Then I published in 2014 on the historicity of Jesus, also with Sheffield Phoenix, a respectable academic peer-reviewed press. And then Raphael Lataster, which I think you really slandered by quoting his previous book from 2015, but you didn't mention the fact that he published with Brill, one of the most prestigious academic publishers in the world. He published Questioning the Historicity of Jesus. So he actually got a peer-reviewed study done years later and published it through a proper method. And you don't address that at all. And in fact, Lataster's study compared my study with the previous works, and important to point out these are previous works, of Maurice Casey and Bart Ehrman, who could not have replied to these studies because they were published before them. So their statements are like decades out of date by now. So if you really want to deal with this, you've got to deal with the actual peer-reviewed literature on this, the actual field literature on this subject. And that would be Lataster, Brody, and myself. And there's just no way to, and that's why everything you said is false, because you're not actually looking at these studies. And so you don't know what they contain. They contain the exact opposite of almost everything you said. And so, yeah, it just really frustrates me to see this, and I think it's inappropriate to try and misrepresent Lataster as having not published under peer review through a peer review respectable press, to slag off our presses, to just claim Sheffield Phoenix is not a respectable press, that it's not an academic press, that it's not a peer-reviewed press. I mean, this is the kind of slander and attacks that we've been dealing with for 20 years now. And I find it deeply offensive, and it just continues this idea that like we do everything. We hit every freaking bar that we're supposed to hit, and then you just ignore us and slag us off anyway. And then when we point out that we've actually hit these bars, we've actually published under peer review, people like you will come around and say, why are you constantly mentioning that you published under peer review? Other scholars don't mention that they published under peer review. Well, it's because of people like you that we have to keep repeating this fact that we published under peer review. It's because the argument was started by dogmatists like you who are ignoring our work and are sitting here claiming that we're not doing it properly, we're not doing it under peer review, we're not meeting these methodological requirements. We absolutely are, and we've done it. And so the slandering and lies about what the actual status of this is ridiculous. And I've also pointed out, and I'll point it out, it's in that article that I mentioned everybody can go look at regarding Bill Cooke's article from last year, which is all the same stuff that was in this. Almost 50 scholars now, fully qualified scholars, publicly agree in the 21st century that mythicism is at least plausible. That's a lot of mainstream scholars. It's not a bunch of these amateurs publishing, self-publishing, and all this stuff that was falsely claimed in this talk. So I think this is deeply misrepresented. There's a lot of other methodological issues here, but I addressed them in that article. People can follow it up there. And I'm just going to mute myself now because this stuff kind of pisses me off. I'm getting emotional.
Bill, would you like to respond?
I'm not quite sure what to say, really. I've read his book on the historicity of Jesus on my shelf. I've read very widely around this subject for 30 odd years. The academic standing of the mythical Jesus remains problematic. Were it to be not problematic, you would find peer-reviewed articles in the Journal for the Historical Jesus and things like that. So having been published here and there is not the point I haven't said that. What I've said is that it doesn't have the same standing. So Charles Freeman's published in by Yale University Press. You don't get much better than that. That is a seriously reputable publisher. So the odd mythicist is being published. Okay, so what? That's not the point. The point is the argument is still marginal, is latently anti-Semitic. It's not specifically, but it's latently anti-Semitic. And it's an embarrassment and a problem to humanism generally. And it's one we need to hold at arm's length.
Thanks, Bill. I'm sorry we don't have time for any more questions. We're overrunning a little bit. Thanks everyone for the questions. I won't lie, I quite enjoy a bit of the fisticuffs of this sort, so happy to see it in a way. But I don't think that should detract from your time and effort, Bill, that you put into this. And thank you for engaging with the debate.
And
As a
thank you everybody for coming to this and listening, and hopefully you can make your own mind up now.
Yeah, and the Freethinker itself doesn't have a position on this, so we're open to hosting articles and counter articles if anyone should be interested. But for now, I think that will do us. I was going to share my screen, but I've lost my little PowerPoint thing somewhere in the digital wilderness. But if you check out freethinker.co.uk, you can find our articles, upcoming events, more webinars. You can find our historical archive, and you can also donate to us if you feel like it. But for now, thanks again very much, Bill, and thanks everyone for coming along.
Thank you.